So Marcion ultimately was rejected by the Orthodox Church, the church that became what we think of as sort of conventional traditional Christianity. But I would argue, and there's the incredibly compelling evidence for this, Marcionism, that is the logic of Marcion's ideas, that there's basically two gods. The God of Christianity is one God who's pure and gracious and good. And then there's the God of Judaism who is judgmental and harsh and stern. And basically that everyone can be saved, Marcion taught, except kind of the leaders of the Jewish people. He had this incredibly kind of horribly anti-Jewish sort of eschatology in which like the great patriarchs of the Jewish people were basically the only people that weren't saved by Jesus, because, so you can see already this incredible antipathy to what we today call Judaism and the Jewish people and their religious customs in Marcion. And therefore, Marcion represents, from my standpoint as a philosopher and a historian of philosophy and religion, Marcion represents, you could say, the most purified or intense form of Christian anti-Judaism that has ever existed. There's basically two really profound forms of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, sort of just antipathy, structural patterns of antipathy to the Jewish people and their traditions and customs that come directly out of Christianity. The first form is much more well known, and I've already touched on it. It's called supersessionism, and supersessionism has is a historical logic. Judaism is like an older, sibling, or Judaism is an older parent that Christianity replaces and supersedes. So supersession has the idea of replacement built into it, and it has the idea of relevance based on kind of nowness. Like something could be relevant for a time, like Christians have traditionally said Judaism was true or it was relevant, but then the nature of the Jewish faith was transformed when Jesus came. This is the Christian traditional belief. And therefore, somehow the Jews are making a mistake, for example, to still be obeying the Torah, even though God tells them to do this eternally in the text that Christians inherit as their own Bible. So that created a really, really big problem. There is an intense logical internal tension between the Christian position of supersessionism and the maintaining of the entire Tanakh or Bible of the Jewish people in their canon. Because then, like I said in one of the earlier lectures, you have all these problems. Like, what do you do with the law? What do you do with all of these teachings that Jewish people are still actually actively engaging with and are therefore the relevant people to kind of understand? And Jews, we know, were very accepting of visitors, Christians, and others in synagogues for hundreds of years in the time of Jesus. Christians, what we call Christians, were visiting synagogues. We know this well into the 4th and 5th century. So there was a strong active interest in the Jewish people and their customs, partly because, the Christians had their scriptures and understood that obviously these come from the Jewish people. So Marcionism is a really different, much more radical, you could say uncompromising version of the rejection of Judaism. It says not that Judaism, sort of was valid. Marcion thinks Judaism is valid for the Jewish people. Like I said, he believed their God was real and believed that their God was the creator. And in this way, he was part of a very strong movement in the ancient world that we often call Gnosticism or other things, but it's more helpful at a broad level to just think of it as he's part of a very strong dualistic impulse in the ancient world in which there were sort of two very distinct gods, which you see most famously in Manichaeism. So there was a strong dualistic impulse in the ancient world to see the origin of evil and the origin of goodness as being fundamentally separate things. And therefore, evil had a kind of active power in the world. So Marcion, in a way, takes this idea of a kind of bad God and literally maps it onto the Jewish God. And so I therefore think there is no sort of more pristine or obviously toxic form, you could say, of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism than Marcion's form of religion, because it really is a completely unflinching condemnation at a cosmic theological level of the Jewish people. And it is a complete historical lie, of course. Jesus was Jewish. So it obviously represents an incredibly deep tension on the part of people who wanted to be associated with the tradition and name and power of Jesus, but not the Bible of the people that Jesus came from. If you're from a religious background where you were exposed to the Bible, I think you're going to know what I'm about to say is really true about almost everyone. It's particularly true, you could say, of Catholics, but it's true of Protestants too. Most people who read the Bible and who are interested in the Bible, who are not Jewish people, do not understand the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and they treat it as if it's less important and less valuable. And I know I was raised in traditions that this was kind of the background teaching. No one would exactly say it overtly often, but you would get a version of a kind of use of St. Paul's writings, they would say, the epistles from Paul, particularly Romans and Galatians, in which the idea would be a form of Marcionism, even though people didn't know that. That is to say that the law is for the Jews and it's basically bad, and God saved people from having to deal with that God, the God who created the world. And think about that. So Marcion is very radical. So the idea of the Marcionist Bible is a kind of paradox. But Marcion is so important for the Bible because he's rightly seen by historians of Christianity and Judaism as a major catalyst in the canonical sort of textualization process of transforming the Bible into the canonical set of books that we eventually have by the 4th century of the Common Era. What Marcion did was he eliminated the entire Old Testament. He eliminated most of what he called the New Testament, what we call the New Testament, that he thought was too Jewish, and he only preserved a selection of the writings of St. Paul, or Paul, who was a Pharisee, of course. It's kind of strange that, again, Paul is so quickly read out of his Jewish context. But that happened just immediately. Paul's a Pharisee. But by the time you get to Marcion and many other people, Paul can be read as a kind of totally non-Jewish thinker who's been delivered, has been emancipated from his own Jewish background. And so the Bible of Marcion was really just the New Testament. And it was really just part of the New Testament, part of the Gospel of Luke, which he edited out, stuff that was too, pro-Jewish, and because he thought it wasn't original or authentic. And then basically Paul. So it's a very kind of proto-Protestant Bible. And the reason I say proto-Protestant is because it's in particular in the modern world that I think is just very common, particularly people in mainline Protestant denominations. They will have a negative view of the Bible, of the Old Testament. They will be very ignorant of it, typically. And that is directly connected with cultural prejudices that people would say are separate, that Christian cultures still have towards the Jewish people. There is no Christian culture I have any historical familiarity with which isn't characterized by a kind of normalized prejudice against some groups. And the Jewish people, insofar as they're in Christian societies, have always been subject to systematically legitimated by the religious authorities prejudice and abuse. And the deepest source of this is, I'm suggesting, this tension within Christianity itself. And it's obviously the case that Christianity and anti-Semitism are deeply compatible, which, whatever you think about it, it shouldn't be the case that that's possible. Given what Christians say that they believe, it shouldn't be the case that it's possible to be both anti-Semitic and to say you're sort of somehow delivered or saved by a Jewish figure who came to fulfill Jewish prophecies that would eventually bring benefit and salvation to the nations or the Gentiles, which is what Christians claim when they say that they're Christians, followers of the Christos or the Messiah of Israel. So it is logically and on the surface, it doesn't make any sense. But of course, Jewish people know perfectly well, it is the unfortunate truth of Christian history that it has been basically a religion that has always persecuted the Jewish people in most of its forms that have been institutionalized.